Let me turn now to our second lecture, and you may have noticed our focus has shifted somewhat from yesterday to today. Yesterday we talked about the theoretical history of writing, the way people compose their books, and today we're concentrating much more on the physical objects themselves, whether books that we're going to talk about first, or calligraphy that we're going to talk about later. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jessica Evans, who's going to introduce our second speaker, Kristine Rose Beers.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Evans. I'm a junior art history major at Virginia Commonwealth University. And today I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Kristine Rose Beers. Ms. Beers is currently senior conservator at the Chester Beatty Library that we've mentioned so frequently in Dublin, and previously worked at the Fitzwilliam Museum in the University of Cambridge. She has written a variety of essays, including It's Not Easy Being Green, an ectroscopic study of green pigments used in illuminated manuscripts, and the conservation of a 17th century Persian Shahnameh. I'm particularly interested in her coming discussion of Islamic bookbinding. So please join me in welcoming Kristine Rose Beers.
Well, as we've seen in the past day, the Islamic book can take many different forms. It might be written in Arabic, but could just as well be written in Ottoman Turkish, Persian, Ahmad or Spanish, Chinese, or any one of the many languages used across the vast Islamic lands during the past 14.5 centuries. In form, it is most usually a group of folios held together in a wrapper or binding to produce the familiar codex format. As a manuscript conservator, I study each object to understand and document its physical condition in preparation for loans, exhibitions, digitization, or access by scholars. As such, my work is primarily concerned with the materials a book is made from and the way in which it works. The materials of the Islamic book can be equally as diverse as the texts and languages in which they were written. Most frequently, they include paper, as we've just heard so eloquently, parchment, pigments and leather, but lacquer, textile, palm leaf, metals, and a plethora of other materials might also be present. Recent conservation approaches are minimally interventive, and invasive treatments are only carried out when natural aging, chemical deterioration, or mechanical wear have compromised an item's stability and long-term preservation. An experienced conservator can adapt treatments and recommendations according to the needs of the object, from a simple instruction on how best to handle a delicate Quran for digitization to the comprehensive interventive repair of an aged and deteriorated binding structure, which is rather like intensive surgery. Whatever the treatment or the specific object that requires such an intervention, the conservator's approach is methodical and cautious. It begins with close observation of the artifact, an analysis of the physical remains in order to establish the causes of deterioration and to understand the requirements of the object that survives. The conservator has a professional responsibility to record as much information as possible from the extant object. This should include physical features, such as the dimensions of the text block, the number of gatherings and their collation, but also more specific material information, such as the type of parchment, paper, or leather. It is done through photography, written surveys, and careful drawings. Discussions with curators or custodians aid understanding of the provenance of the item requiring conservation, and offer both historical and contemporary context. At this point, the conservator might be ready to propose a treatment for the object in question, but their conversation with the object has only just begun. As with any preservation procedure, the conservator's work is required to fit the criteria of stability, reversibility, and minimal intervention. Every treatment must be strong, durable, chemically inert, and easy to reverse in the future should it become necessary. Moreover, it must respect the object's historical and cultural integrity. Reconstructions using technologically accurate methods and techniques might be used, as well as analysis of historic treatises or complementary scientific analyses. This archaeological approach to documentation informs the conservator's treatment of each object. but can also contribute to a fuller understanding of the book as material culture. The structure of the Islamic book consists of upper and lower covers connected by a spine piece. I'll see if I can... That's what we're seeing in this diagram here. Often with an extension of the lower board to form a foredge piece and envelope flap. The text block contained within this cover is formed of a flexible organic substrate, either parchment or, from the 10th century onwards, highly surface-sized and burnished paper. The parchment or paper substrate is folded into sections and joined by a simple unsupported link stitch that holds it in a secure but flexible block. Most frequently, there are only 2 sewing points or stations, and these divide the spine roughly into thirds. To strengthen the text block once it is sewn, a lining of textile or leather is pasted to the spine. I hope you can see this in the illustrations to the left of the screen. End bands are then sewn to consolidate the text block. Usually, a leather core is pasted to the head and tail edge of the block and anchored to the sections with a looping warp stitch. A decorative chevron stitch is then woven across the core, in and out of the warp threads, to form the secondary end band. It is a widely held belief that the structure of Islamic books has remained consistent in form since the 11th century. This is a belief that is gradually being eroded by the closer study of Islamic manuscripts, both by date and geographic region. There are, of course, great differences in the materials and decoration of the books produced throughout the Islamic world. However, there are many considerable ambiguities in the existing descriptions of Islamic manuscript structures, many of which feed misunderstandings of the technology and functionality of these objects. Studies by François de Roche, Valentina Sagaria Rossi, Anna Beni, Georgios Boudalis, and Karen Sherpa are steadily addressing this imbalance. Whilst there are relatively few intact early Islamic bindings in existence, the role played by books in early Islamic societies can be glimpsed through the fragmentary text block and binding evidence that survives. Chester Beatty Library Islamic Manuscript 1404 and Cambridge University Library Additional Manuscript 1138 are both Quran manuscripts made within 3 centuries of the Revelation. They are both multi-quire text blocks made of parchment and are written in Kufic script, but here the obvious material similarities end. Ad 1138 is a small manuscript, probably made in the 9th century. It is a single codex from a multi-volume Quran and measures just 8 by 13.5 by 4 centimetres. That's less than A5, it's rather small. In contrast, is 1404 is a single volume Quran dating from the 7th or 8th century. There's much speculation over its date at the moment. It is a huge manuscript, measuring 47.5 by 38.2 by about 10 centimetres and weighing approximately 7 kilograms, that's 15.5 pounds, in its current disbound state. Both manuscripts exemplify early Islamic manuscript production, but they present greatly contrasting depictions of book arts during the earliest days of the craft. Is 1404's large size is indicative of a no-expense-spared approach to book production. A text block of 200 parchment folios would have required anywhere between 100 and 200 animals to produce. As many of the spine folds are lost and damaged, the precise number of bifolios originally used is extremely difficult to determine. The skins chosen are reasonably consistent in quality, and only the best area of each skin has been used, taking care to avoid keratinous joint areas, scars and holes, or weak and distorted belly sections of the skin. The square, trimmed edges of the folios also suggest that considerable resources were dedicated to the manufacture of this single-volume manuscript, and that large-scale parchment production, rather than domestic enterprise, was readily available. The poor condition of the manuscript may also be indicative of its high status. Unfortunately for the book archaeologist interested in the earliest manifestations of bookbinding, it is often the case that the most precious manuscripts have been repaired and rebound numerous times across centuries, leaving only traces of their earliest, or indeed original, bindings. Frequent rebinding might indicate increased wear due to high usage, but is often also associated with changes in ownership or preparation for sale, where a fashionable new binding might make an already desirable object even more highly sought after. Ad 1138 has survived the centuries remarkably unscathed. It may have been treasured and protected, used only on special occasions, but it's equally possible that it was used infrequently or forgotten on a hidden shelf, allowing its early binding to survive to the present day. The simple raised cord decoration bears similarities to other 8th and 9th century bindings from Egypt, Syria and England, indicative of its early date and origins. The sewing is delicate but intact, and the covering leather is warm but unmodified, suggesting this may in fact be the manuscript's original binding. Although the manuscript is the single volume known to survive from a 30-volume Quran set, its diminutive size and humble materials suggest both that it was intended for personal use and that considerable care had been taken with the costs involved in its production. The materials of this manuscript speak of prudence and careful management. With approximately 100 folios per volume, it is clear that every piece of the skin has been used in spite of natural flaws and imperfections. I'm glad that I was able to get a sheep into this. An average sheepskin might allow 12 bifolios of this size to be cut from it. But where the size of the skin would not allow for a full bifolio, singletons were also cut. This careful use of the parchment might give the maker of the book an additional 3 singletons per skin. The gatherings of Ad 1138 are not collated regularly, indicating a fugal approach to precious materials and allowing a full 30-volume Quran to be made from around 100 skins of parchment. The species of animal a piece of parchment is made from can also add to our understanding of a manuscript. Until recently, the accurate identification of parchment species was notoriously difficult, relying largely on unreliable visual examination of follicle patterns. However, developments in DNA analysis used by the BioArc, that's Biology, Archaeology and Chemistry team at the University of York in the UK, have recently made this information far more accessible. Working in collaboration with conservators, the multidisciplinary BioArc team collects and interprets the DNA evidence preserved in historic manuscripts. An eraser is carefully rubbed across a small section of the parchment between 30 and 40 times, and the resulting fragments of dirty eraser, or Urdu, are collected. The Urdu is then analysed in the UK lab, and the collagen it is picked up is analysed further using mass spectroscopy. By analysing the proteins and DNA from the parchment, it is possible to determine the species of animal it was made from, and sometimes even the region where the animal was reared. This minimally interventive procedure works in much the same way as a forensic cheek swab, picking up loose cells from the surface of the skin without the need for a more invasive procedure. Initial analysis of samples from 8 objects in the Chester Beatty Library's Islamic collection has delivered interesting results. So far, all of the parchment tested has proven to be sheep or calf. In the case of manuscript is 1404, the large manuscript, of the 5 folios we tested, 4 were sheep and 1 was calf. This makes sense considering the large scale of the manuscript and the number of animals required to make it, as discussed earlier. It is also interesting to bear in mind that so far this information contradicts the commonly repeated line that early Islamic manuscripts were written on goat or gazelle skin. In the Chester Beatty manuscripts, this is not the case, nor does it appear to be the case in Egyptian Islamic manuscripts that have otherwise been analysed, where sheep and goat occasionally have been identified. The large scale of IS 1404 also speaks of its usage. In European manuscript cultures, where literacy was frequently lower, as we've heard, large volumes were produced for larger audiences, and shared usage, such as the heavy, oversized choral antiphonals that would have sat in front of the choir, could be viewed. Could it be the case that this early manuscript was intended for use by a group or public audience, as seen in the famous illustration that both Dana and Jonathan have shown us? The physicality of a book influences not only its usage, but the way in which it is read. Ad 1138 opens comfortably in the hand. It is supported naturally in the palm, and the pages can be turned through easily. Is 1404 is large and unwieldy in its present form, but even when newly bound and in pristine condition, it would not have been possible to read it without assistance. To open the volume at 180 degrees on a flat surface, as is seen in the European tradition, would have been possible, but a large volume is easier to read when propped up or somehow supported. The rurl, or an early precursor of this traditional book support, would have been essential if this book were to have been read easily. The way in which a book is read can in turn influence its structure. There is an inextricable link between form and functionality. Books produced in the Islamic world were not used in the same way as those in Western Europe's predominantly Christian cultures. Whilst a Western book was usually read flat on a lectern or table, the rurl allows the Islamic book to open to a maximum of approximately 110 degrees. It facilitates reading and protects the fine bindings of manuscripts in so doing. However, the consistent use of a book rest transfers a considerable mechanical function away from the book's structure and onto the support. The book binding itself no longer needs to be strong enough to support the manuscripts whilst it is read, as the rurl will fulfill this function. Accordingly, the binding structure becomes a decorative first layer enclosure, which works in conjunction with the secondary support of the rurl, the more robust machine. The Islamic book structure has often been dismissed as weak and insubstantial, prone to breakage and failure. In my opinion, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the technology and functionality of these objects, which in fact more likely represent the evolution of a type of ergonomic system. The deterioration of historic Islamic bindings has occurred where the most vulnerable points of the structure are coupled with finely made but now aged and weak materials, such as silk sewing thread that breaks, allowing sections to come loose, and extremely thin paired leather that fractures when it no longer has sufficient mechanical strength to maintain the flexibility of board attachments. The deterioration of these materials has been facilitated by poor handling, where manuscripts have been opened at a greater angle than was intended for these fine structures or permitted by the rurl, facilitating the deterioration of already age-weakened elements. It is a combination of negative factors rather than a fundamental flaw that has resulted in these manuscripts being perceived as weak. The interaction between the Islamic book and the rurl allowed initially simple mechanical elements to develop in another direction, to an aesthetic that was both highly refined and surprisingly functional. In the past, a fundamental misunderstanding of structural differences between Islamic and European bindings has often led to the unsympathetic and incompatible treatment of Islamic manuscripts by European-trained binders. Examples of Islamic manuscripts sewn on supports and rounded and backed in the European style can be seen throughout many collections and bear witness to change in ownership or journeys through sales rooms and continents. The phenomena of vertical storage is a similarly detrimental Western fashion. It can be associated with mass-produced printed volumes and the emergence of the gentleman's library, where the visibility of large numbers of gold-tooled book spines were intended to indicate both wealth and knowledge. Manuscripts are not designed for vertical storage. Text blocks detach and spines collapse in Western book bindings, whilst covers are abraded and M-bands knocked off when Islamic books are stood up and pushed onto overcrowded shelves. Since medieval times, treatises and poems about bookbinding were written and dedicated to the most revered practitioners of Islamic book arts. Throughout the 20th century, a number of scholars wrote critical editions and translations of the earliest bookbinding treaties that survived. However, their interpretations have been challenged by the great variations in technical terminology across different regions and the difficulties of understanding terms hundreds of years after they were recorded. There is as well the intrinsic difficulty of working out instructions from a descriptive text lacking illustrations. This is especially true when the translator or scholar is not a bookbinder, him or herself. Through careful direct observation of artifacts and reconstructions of historic binding structures with models, conservators and bookbindings can contribute to clarification of obscure passages of treaties with their deep practical knowledge of historic bookbinding techniques. In the case of Ad 1138, reconstruction of the historic binding in parallel with readings of contemporary treaties such as that of Ibn Badis or Al-Ishbili enhanced both our understanding of the object and its conservation. For example, the binding of this small manuscript uses 2 pieces of leather to cover the wooden boards. As this is a small volume, it seems peculiar to carry out this simple process in 2 stages rather than 1. However, during the reconstruction of the binding, the decision to cover in the book with 2 pieces suddenly makes sense. Firstly, it bears witness to the same economy of materials that is seen in the composite quire formation, using up offcuts and every last piece of an expensive and precious resource. But secondly, it gives the binder time to work the damp leather around the relief cordwork, a sensible practical measure that is only easily observed when a reconstruction of the binding is made. Manuscript 261, 1948, is a richly illustrated Bustan of Sadi, now held in the Fitzwilliam Museum, University of Cambridge. It was made in Kashmir in 1505. It has 16 original miniatures and a 17th at the beginning, thought to have been added later in the 16th century. But the interventive conservation of this manuscript revealed evidence of international travel and deliberate deception. Thanks to a grant from the Sumitomo Foundation, I surveyed this manuscript in advance of its treatment. Evidence of an unsympathetic European rebinding was clear from the typical Western rounded spine profile, missing end bands, and notable disruption along both the inner and outer board joints. The manuscript opening was heavily restricted, and almost a quarter of the page was hidden along the spine edge. These restrictive opening characteristics were also causing damage to the heavily sized and burnished paper pages, where they compounded the damage to the ruled text panel borders. These borders had begun to discolour and break due to the corrosive copper-containing pigments they were drawn with. The decision was taken to disbind the manuscript in order to remove the main cause of the structural damage, the strain of the inflexible Western readback, and to allow repair of the split and degraded ruled margins. It is desirable for a book to open well enough for the content of each page to be viewed in its entirety, without putting unnecessary strain on either the sewing or the pages. It is also preferable that there be no adhesive in direct contact with the spine area of the text block, as these can be both restrictive and damaging to the sections and the sewing. When the modern hollowback spine was released, clear evidence of when and where the manuscript was last bound was immediately revealed. On a printed 20th century spine lining, irrefutable evidence that this manuscript was last repaired and rebound in 1930s France. With the text block disbound, further anomalies became strikingly apparent. Whilst the body of the text block was written on traditional Islamic paper, the paper that Jonathan has just described to us, that is paper made of bast fibres formed on a flexible mould screen, then surface-sized and burnished to a glossy sheen, the first folio of the text block had a distinctly different texture. In breaking light, the folio appeared to have a pitted surface, and when touched, the surface felt soft and lacked the characteristic smoothness of Islamic paper. When placed on a light box for repair, the reason for this became clear. The folio was formed of a sheet of heavily machine-made European wove paper. Clear tear marks, visible as dark shadows in transmitted light, revealed that the sheet had been split before it was adhered to the first folio of the original manuscript. As repair continued, the second half of the split wove paper folio was found adhered at the end of the text block. This deliberate effort to make the front and back of the text block look the same suggests it was a deliberate action taken to mislead a viewer on their first contact with the manuscript. And as wove paper was first made by James Watman in 1757, the date for this insertion was pulled away from the 16th century and into the mid-18th. The physical repair and examination of the manuscript was complemented by non-invasive technical examination of the manuscript's pigments. The analysis revealed the use of modern materials in some areas. Both FORS and XRF spectra identified cerulean blue and zinc white in the illustration on the inserted first folio, neither of which was invented before the 1850s. This provided an earliest date for the apparent restoration of this manuscript and confirmed that folio 1 and its entire decoration was a modern 19th century insertion and not a 16th century restoration as previously believed. The ability to identify the pigments and binding media used in book illustration provides a powerful tool to further categorize and characterize artworks in conjunction with complementary stylistic analyses. Using a range of non-invasive analytical techniques, meaning that no samples are ever taken from the manuscripts, investigations can be carried out in situ. The aim of such technical analyses is to identify the materials used, including pigments, paint binders and inks, or other materials used for underdrawings, and then combining the information about compositional elements and stylistic attributes with the knowledge of artists' materials and techniques to provide a more fully developed characterization of the palette and working methodologies of Islamic book artists. Another interesting discovery in this manuscript is the range of metallic pigments used in its decoration. The borders that surround the miniatures were painted with brass, and bodies of water, initially assumed to be composed of darkened silver foil, were instead found to be composed mainly of tin, as in the ponds depicted. It is possible that brass was used to imitate gold, but as it has now deteriorated, in many areas it appears entirely green. For manuscript conservators, collaboration with scientists who can undertake spectroscopic imaging and non-destructive material testing has become an important factor when making decisions about treatments and interventions. For instance, the precise identification of metallic pigments in this manuscript allows conservators to offer guidance as to the best storage materials and environmental conditions necessary to reduce the chance of further discoloration and tarnishing. However, technical analysis is a highly specialised area of study, requiring considerable training, expensive equipment, and a clearly formulated work plan. Whilst these studies can be helpful to conservation, codicology, and all other areas of bibliographical studies, attention must be paid to determining why analytical examination is useful and when it should be employed. The archaeology of binding structures and the manuscripts they contain is one in which book conservators have a unique opportunity to contribute due to their highly specialised training and their intimate contact with historic artefacts. Systematic examination reveals the complexities of manuscript construction. Moreover, this is a field of study with direct relevance to other more traditionally understood areas of manuscript scholarship. Through multidisciplinary study and collaboration, we can better develop an understanding of the regional and chronological variations of many features of Islamic binding structures and further enhance our comprehension of historic sources with collaborative translations made available in multiple languages. Further discussion across subjects with regards to local, specific religious and cultural needs can then be considered, whether in Dublin or Doha. In conclusion, it stands to reason that if we wish to ensure the long-term preservation of Islamic manuscripts, we must develop a more complete understanding of the many aspects of their intrinsic cultural value. Only then will it be possible to ensure the sensitive preservation of Islamic binding structures and that of the delicate and always unique manuscripts they contain. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kristine, and as someone who has worked under Kristine learning how to make some of these manuscripts, I can only tell you that end bands are a nightmare. I think these two papers beautifully fit together, and they're going to lead into what we're going to have after the break, which is the illustrations and the combination of text and illustration in a manuscript, and then the collecting of these kinds of calligraphies and manuscripts.